Now, our next topic, do not delete risks related to employee use of personal devices and third-party messaging. Joining us today is Tricia Fratto. Tricia is General Counsel of Ethics Suite. She's based in New York. This is a nationwide company, actually global in scope. And she's the co-founder, along with her other co-founder, Juliette Gust, who we work with both routinely. They focus on compliance software solutions, including employee whistleblower platforms and compliance consulting services. And she'll speak a little bit more about that during her presentation. She's the former director of global investigations for Starwood Hotels. And prior to that, she was in a law firm practice in white collar litigation and has a wealth of experience in investigations, particularly the internal ones and forensic investigations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tricia Fratto.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's nice to see everyone and some familiar faces. Juliette said you're probably sick of her since she did the last 16 presentations. I said it's impossible to be sick of her.
Never, never. That's right.
Right. So today, as Stephen said, we're going to talk about the risks associated with allowing employees to bring their own devices. And most importantly, how to mitigate the risks if you decide to allow it. I'm going to go through a little bit of background. We're going to talk about the advantages of allowing team members to do this. We'll talk about the risks, of course, and how we're going to mitigate the risks. There's a recent DOJ guidance regarding ephemeral messaging apps that we'll talk about, and then how to address that in your program. Then we'll just go through the key takeaways and then, of course, leave time for any questions that you might have. Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. So by way of background, I think everyone probably knows this already, but the term is BYOD, bring your own device, and it's allowing employees to utilize their personal devices. It could be a phone, it could be a tablet or a laptop, or some combination. So we also have the term, here's your own device, HYOD, which is where you are providing one of these. So you can have any combination there of the two. According to Frost & Sullivan, BYOD programs have grown exponentially in popularity. Around 80% of companies use some form of BYOD since 2018. CBS News reports that 2 out of 3 employees will try and access company data from their own device, even when it's not permitted. So this kind of highlights the importance of, even if you don't allow BYOD, addressing unauthorized access. We can go to the next slide, Marilyn, thanks. Okay, so here's the upside. And, these are fairly obvious, but, there's very strong indicators of why people would want to do this. So familiarity, everyone knows their own device. They know how to operate it, theoretically. You don't have to provide training if, like, say someone is a Mac user and you would provide a Windows PC. You don't have to have that kind of the lift necessary for someone to learn a new device. So increase in efficiency, really. Obvious cost savings. If you don't have to purchase the device, then you have saved money. You can also address this in your policies, whether, for example, cell phones, if you are going to pay for it or if the user is responsible for it. So you don't have to lay out the money for it or repair it. And it's flexible. It's particularly law firms will love this one. Employees are able to work remotely from any location at any time. Okay, so the risks, they're pretty substantial, so mitigating them is important. It's harder to manage what confidential company information is accessed. It is harder to regulate appropriate use, and data retrieval is an issue. So We need to set out clear guidelines for this. If there's a regulatory request, legal end of employment, internal investigation, we need to have a very firm structure around how data is going to be accessed. This one was really surprising to me that despite, well, to me because policies are my life, despite the fact that 80% of companies are allowing BYOD, only 39% of organizations have a formal BYOD policy. So this is a really big exposure. So we're going to talk about mitigating the risks associated with BYOD within the framework of a BYOD policy, which you absolutely must have if you are going to allow this use. So we'll start with just the basics. Define what's permitted. Is it a laptop? Is it a cell phone? Is it any device? Explain the purpose of your policy is protecting data and preservation. Define the terms. So what is confidential data? What do you consider confidential data? Who owns the data? Obviously, the answer is the company, but we need to say that. What are the information systems that are applicable to the policy? What is personally identifiable information and related, and how is that going to be used? Then we need to ensure that all the team members understand that in order to, if they choose to use their own device, they are also giving up certain privacy rights. Meaning, if there's an internal investigation, if there's a legal request, if there's a regulatory request, some personal data may be captured during data retrieval, and they need to understand that. You can also add to your policy that if personal information is accessed or is retrieved inadvertently, that you have a destruction process for that. Okay, so Marilyn, I'm missing slides. Nope, my notes are out of order. Sorry, guys. The best way to ensure the team members know what is expected of them is just lay out the rules of the road. And some of these seem quite obvious, but it's something that you really want to capture in your policy, your policies and procedures. So everyone needs to use a secure password to protect their device, not 1, 2, 3, 4. Be very specific, PIN or alphanumeric when possible, strong passwords using letters, numbers, special characters. They need to know that they need to use their best efforts to physically secure their device against loss, against theft, or use by people not authorized to use the device. And that seems obvious, but let's say that your policy allows cell phone use. I know, at least in my house, my husband and my daughter love to access my cell phone. And while they're not looking for confidential data, this is something to be aware of. It includes family members. Use only approved devices and have mobile device management on all of the approved devices. Install required applications so that confidential data cannot be read by people not authorized to see it. Careful use of devices in public spaces, meaning, are you accessing very sensitive data in Starbucks and who can see that? Maintain the original operating systems, and that means updating when required. Accessing only known communication networks, so not public, not unknown, or a not trusted network. Okay. So only store data on devices if the data is encrypted using default encryption technology. And what that is will vary by the organization. Except for email, obviously we can access that via the internet most often, only connecting through approved communication channels, such as a VPN. Devices need to be up to date with virus and spyware detection and protection software, personal firewalls included. Properly using devices in ways they are designed or intended by the manufacturer, meaning not making modifications, removing restrictions, or so-called jailbreaking a device. Again, installing any company required software on the device. Have a process for employees to report breaches, any disclosures or possible disclosures or malware infections, and set up, obviously, and follow a notification process to either supervisors or IT or both if a device is lost or stolen, and make sure that your team members understand if this happens, IT is going to remotely wipe the device to prevent unauthorized access to confidential information. I know that one would scare me, and losing 26,000 photos in one swoop. So also a very important part. You can go ahead to the next slide, Mira. Okay. Next part is the prohibiting. Prohibit using personal devices in a way that violates any company policy. What would this look like? So let's say you are accessing financial data and you're not supposed to be, and you're downloading it to your personal device. Permitting anyone else, again, to access the personal devices unless they're specifically authorized. Prohibit storing any illegal materials or installing unlicensed software. The unlicensed software obviously can result in data breach or compromising confidential information. Sorry that some of this is a little redundant because I took it from a policy, so I like to be redundant in a policy. Connecting to any unknown, unsecured, or public Wi-Fi networks. Locally storing passwords in an unencrypted manner. I know a lot of people do this. They'll put all their passwords in a note, and if the device is compromised, all of those passwords will be fair game. And transferring confidential data to any personal devices without authorization. In some instances, people will work locally, and that's okay. But in other instances, you want more of a Google Docs scenario where people are accessing but not preserving data. So some other critical policy components: explain that the company may need to collect data from their personal device. Explain the circumstances under which this might happen. So again, it could be an internal investigation, it could be a regulatory request, it could be for the purpose of discovery and litigation. Make sure that you clearly spell out the employee discipline for violating the company's policy. Should be up to and including termination of employment, and also explain that there is a potential for civil or criminal liability in these instances. Require that team members annually or as requested certify that they understand and will comply with the BOD policy, and make sure that you maintain records of the same. Remind employees not to use work email for personal reasons to avoid inadvertent collection of PII. So they understand that when there is a need to collect data, that anything that they have used company email or other systems for personal use will be collected as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the recent DOJ guidance. It came out in March 2023, and it discusses the use of ephemeral or encrypted messaging applications. If you are elderly like me, you may not know what an ephemeral app is. It is an automatic deleting of text messages after a certain period of time. I personally have never used one of these, but they are extremely popular. Encrypted messaging applications include things like WhatsApp or Slack. The DOJ originally had prohibited using ephemeral or encrypted messaging, well, not prohibited, but had not given full cooperation credit to companies if they used ephemeral or encrypted applications because they're harder to collect data from. But they now have moved towards recognizing that it's convenient for quick communications, and it also lowers data storage costs significantly. So the current guidance indicates prosecutors will now focus on whether controls implemented around the communications are sufficient considering the company's risk profile. So, for example, if you're in a highly regulated industry, which we are not, such as finance, the use of these types of apps is very high risk. So we can see from the SEC that there have been very high value judgments against financial companies because they were not able to collect data. And similarly, other than the DOJ and the SEC, in regular litigation, if you're using encrypted messaging and the court finds that you were doing it to avoid discovery, that will incur liability. Prosecutors are instructed to look at actual use of the apps. Why are you using them? What is the purpose? And the rationale for the company's determination of which apps is permitted is also considered. So we need to look at which apps are being used, why are they being used, and you should be well versed in the retention periods of each of the apps and which you're going to authorize. And if anybody is curious about that, I found a list from the FBI of these types of apps and their data storage capabilities. Okay, so what do you do next? We've talked about the risks. We've talked about the DOJ's position and possible litigation. So you need to assess your company's risk profile and your current usage. So do you need to use ephemeral apps at all? And if not, consider prohibiting the use for business purposes. If it's a benefit to your company to use the ephemeral apps, and in many instances it is because of data storage costs like we talked about, and quicker communication, especially if you have international operations, If you're going to go ahead and do that, you need to explicitly address and explain how these apps are to be used in your BYOD policy. And there's no right or wrong answer for this. So you need to evaluate what types of communications are authorized, what types are explicitly not authorized. Make sure that when you're structuring this, that you have not compromised your compliance program or have interfered with your ability to conduct internal investigations or respond to regulatory or legal requests. So an example of compromising your compliance program would be allowing users to submit their expenses using an ephemeral app or request gift and hospitality authorization, because those are the types of things that you want to keep for a longer retention period than would be allowed for an ephemeral app. Review and revise your document retention policy as needed. This is often overlooked on the ephemeral app side, that this is also data. So it needs to be in there, it needs to be specifically addressed, and the retention period. So here are our key takeaways. If you're allowing employees to use personal devices to access company data and systems, you must, not negotiable, have a comprehensive BYOD policy. It's absolutely the best way to mitigate the risks associated with this. Again, require yearly and as requested certification of understanding and compliance with the BYOD policy and maintain these records. And thoughtfully consider the use of ephemeral apps in light of the DOJ guidance and potential discovery obstacles. And enjoy your BOD policy. That is a typo. You should, of course, enjoy your BYOD policy. But what I meant to say here is enforce your BYOD policy. If you don't enforce it regularly, consistently, you just have a piece of paper and you are not protected. Oh, is there a question?
None of us. There is a question, and I'll read it to you in just a second. But that darn autocorrect gets us every time, right?
It sure does.
Yeah, it does. And just for those, I may have missed it, Tricia, but a good example of an ephemeral type app is Snapchat.
Yes.
Which if you don't know about, I promise your kids do.
Yes.
And I promise you they're using it for things you may or may not want to know about. Let's get to this question, Tricia. That was terrific information. And the question, and the person that asked the question also thinks it was terrific. But let me get right to the question. Do you have any guidance regarding whether or not it is reasonable to do an audit of an employee's personal devices? Let's start with that. That would be part of the policy, right? That they need to be aware if they're using their personal device. I think you mentioned this, it's subject to some audit from time to time and or remote wiping. Is that a fair restatement of what you shared? Okay.
Absolutely. And it really needs, I'm sorry, Stephen, I interrupted you, but it really needs to be addressed in the policy that the BYOD is optional, and you need an acknowledgement that they understand that they're giving up some right to privacy by doing it. So if they want the convenience, they want to use their own device, then they have to acknowledge that, and they have to understand that there will be periodic audits of their use. Absolutely.
No problem with that. Now, what about a few thoughts on how to conduct the audit? How practically, I think, is the question. How does that happen? If I'm going to audit a personal device of an employee? Such a good question. Yeah,
that is a good question. So it's generally done in an IT setting with the mobile device management.
Okay. They'll actually, they need to share their passcode, or they need to open the device. And then we obviously, we want to stay away from personal information. Right. And so just stay strictly focused on the business, so we don't run into, so I think we can get some guidance from some of the eavesdropping type decisions that were made early on, right? As soon as you find out it's personal, you've got an obligation to move away.
Back out.
Is that fair?
Yes.
So, but if I'm a smaller operator, and I want to, my employees use their personal devices, I still have the right to audit. It's in my policy, and they've consented to it. And even though, for the reasons you mentioned, I think, reasons you mentioned, that there might be a regulatory investigation, right? There could be litigation. What about if I just have a reasonable suspicion? I know that gets us into some real challenging issues, but what are your thoughts about that?
If you have a reasonable suspicion of what?
That they downloaded some financial information that they're not supposed to. So, there's maybe a trail that shows that happened.
Yeah, so that would be covered by internal investigations, and that should be in your policy. So if that is absolutely fair game.
Oh, okay. Gosh, Tricia, great information. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, take a snapshot. Take a screen. Speaking of autocorrect, take a screenshot or a photo of Tricia's information. I promise you will be glad you did. She and Juliet are amazing at what they do. They can help you create policies. They can consult with you on all of your procedures. And of course, they create hotlines for your employees to be able to call anonymously. They have developed a fabulous suite of services, and I hope you'll spend some time looking into them and contact them, at least for some education around what it is you're trying to accomplish. Tricia, as always, thank you kindly.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.